To be a Bhutto is to be born into a troubled Pakistani political dynasty, a divided family whose history shadows that of the country itself. The widower of the late Benazir Bhutto is Pakistan's current president, but he's denounced as a criminal by Benazir's own niece, Fatima Bhutto. Fatima, the daughter of Benazir's brother Murtaza, is no less critical of her late aunt. Murtaza was assassinated 11 years before Benazir. Now, Fatima Bhutto has written the story of her father and her family, and she's one of the most outspoken critics of the current regime in Pakistan. She's in Australia as a guest of the Sydney Writers' Festival. I spoke with her earlier. Fatima Bhutto, welcome to Lateline.
Thank you for having me.
Very early on in your book, you express outrage at US drone attacks on Pakistani soil. You write, "Never before have we allowed a foreign country to carry out strikes on our soil." You've never held back your criticism of American involvement in Pakistan. What was your response to the strike against Osama bin Laden?
Well, it was more of the same. It wasn't surprising for anyone who's been watching the last few years, where you have American operations on Pakistani soil almost daily, if not weekly.
Not always, though, involving, I suppose, operatives physically on your soil.
Well, that's questionable. We know, thanks to the hot pursuit agreement that was signed by General Pervez Musharraf, the former president, and General Stanley McChrystal, that it's on the books between America and Pakistan that America can enter our country at will. They can engage in kill or capture operations on our soil. And our government will always reserve the right to deny that they knew anything about it, while still giving the green light.
And how high do you think that knowledge would have gone?
It ought to have gone to the highest level of government, certainly.
What does this mean for Pakistan's relationship with the US? The Pakistani parliament's just passed a resolution calling for a permanent halt to US drone strikes and threatening to block supply routes to troops in Afghanistan.
Well, we know from WikiLeaks that this is all lip service that the Pakistani Prime Minister had said when he was told that drone strikes would be carried out on his country, that America was free to do so and that they would make a bit of noise in Parliament about it, but really they would leave the road wide open or the skies wide open. So this seems to be more of the same again. If the Pakistani government truly wants to end drone strikes, they've started a bit late, actually. It's some 2,000 Pakistanis have been killed since the Obama White House began this ferocious campaign against our country. And now to say that they're upset seems disingenuous.
This resolution that was passed happened after Parliament was briefed by top military officials, and it's been reported as a united front between the military and the civilian rulers. How significant is that united front? Indeed, does it exist?
Well, we don't. I don't think we can know really whether it truly exists, but certainly we know that this is a government and this is a state, or rather this is a political establishment that serves and operates on its own levels. It doesn't really connect to the Pakistani people. The Pakistani people have been complaining about these drone strikes since they began, since 2005, 2006. Never before have the military or the government bothered to put a united front up to support the concerns and the suffering of those affected by the drone strikes till now.
But I wonder, I guess the question is, has the military in some way been damaged by this? Is this an opportunity for the civilian government to perhaps take more authority? I mean, you write that the military has always called the shots in Pakistan.
Well, I'm not sure that's true in this case, because the military was the first to issue any statement after Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan. It took the Prime Minister 2 weeks to address his country, and when he did so in English, which meant that large portions wouldn't have understood a word he said. And the President has yet to say a word. In fact, the only thing he has said was to write an op-ed for the Washington Post, again also in English. So it's not very clear that the civilian government is taking the reins at all, not from inside Pakistan at least.
So in your view, the military does still pull the strings in Pakistani politics?
Well, they've always pulled the strings. And are they pulling any more strings at the moment? I'm not sure that's true. But they've been the only ones really coming out to speak.
2 years ago, you called Pakistan a country which seemed to be hell-bent on self-destruction. Do you still describe it like that?
This is a state that seems hell-bent on self-destruction. It seems to be a political system that is so destructive it cannot even provide the most basic amenities for its people. So the price of wheat, for example, wheat is sold in Pakistan now above international prices. We are an agricultural country. We are a rice-growing, wheat-growing country that can't afford to feed its own people anymore. That either comes from incredible incompetence or a combination of incompetence, corruption, and self-destruction.
And do you think it's the latter?
Most likely, yes.
Then what gives you hope?
Because that's the state and that's the government, and we know that they, in any place, the government are not necessarily their people. And Pakistanis are a nation of survivors. They're a nation of people who persevere in the face of a state that doesn't provide justice, that doesn't provide education, that doesn't provide health. They come together to take care of each other. This is how it's always been in Pakistan, and it's a curse, really, the politics of the country, that such a strong people have been saddled with such weak rulers.
But it sounds almost defeatist, as if that is the way it will be. How do you change that? I mean, you look at what happened around you and what's happened in the Middle East, your former homeland of Syria, you look at Egypt, you look at Bahrain, and do you see anything that perhaps sparks a light and makes you think about what could happen in Pakistan?
Well, in Pakistan, it's not defeatist, because we know what keeps the system running is vast amounts of foreign aid. When the state or the military or both receive billions and billions and billions of dollars in American money every year, it's incredibly difficult for nascent, progressive, democratic, secular forces to fight that kind of money. And looking at the Arab Spring, we've got the objective conditions in Pakistan too. We have unemployment, we have inflation, we have food inflation. We have something like 60% of our population under the age of 30. It all exists, and it is a concern. Why hasn't this happened in Pakistan?
Well, in theory, you have democratic institutions.
Well, in theory, in the same way that they had them in Egypt. We have a president who, like the president before him, like our last dictator, was never elected to public office. He doesn't have any mandate from the people. He was simply selected. The joke in Pakistan is not that we have elections, but rather we have selections. If it weren't true, it would be more funny, potentially.
So why hasn't there been an Arab Spring, if you like, in Pakistan?
Well, I think you have several reasons, perhaps. I mean, one is illiteracy. You have a population that is, according to official figures, something like 40% literate. And the qualification for literacy in Pakistan is simply the ability to sign your name. So those are very inflated numbers. You also have incredible interference in Pakistan's politics. So whenever anything happens that slightly unnerves America, for example, an envoy is sent, a secretary of state is sent, phone calls are made, and things are pulled back. And we saw this happen in 2009 with the lawyers' movement that was building steam again. And as it was building steam and it looked like the army was not going to intercede and was going to allow the protest to go forward, David Miliband called up the heads of political parties, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made her own phone calls, and the movement ended.
Is it as simple as withdrawing all foreign aid, of saying Pakistan stands on its own 2 feet? And can you, in any sense, imagine that would happen, given the geographical significance of Pakistan to countries like the US?
Well, the aid that goes to Pakistan, and its billions and billions of dollars worth of aid money, doesn't reach anyone except the state. We are a nuclear-armed country that missed our millennium goals to eradicate polio because we couldn't refrigerate the vaccines. That's the effect of corruption in Pakistan. This is a government that, before it took office, was facing corruption charges in Switzerland, in the United Kingdom, in France, and in its own country, and was estimated by the New York Times to have taken somewhere between $2 to $3 billion in their previous tenures. So we have to wonder then how we can be assured that any money that goes to Pakistan will reach its people. And we saw during the floods that happened at the end of last year, the most devastating natural disaster in Pakistan's history, almost no money come to the country because no one felt confident that that money would reach flood victims. So if we're serious about Pakistan, if we're serious about changing the dynamics of this country, then we cannot keep funding governments that are grossly corrupt and violent.
Of course, just to remind the audience that you're talking about a government where the president is the widower of your late aunt, Benazir Bhutto, a man who you describe as a criminal. Do you still hold hope of getting justice for your father and his execution?
I don't hold much hope of getting justice under this government. Since President Zardari took office, he's not only acquitted himself in my father's murder case, in the middle of an ongoing murder case, but in the 3 other murder cases he was standing trial in. Justice, I think, is not something most Pakistanis expect in this day and age. We look to other means to get justice, through memory, through survival, but not through the courts, which seem incapable of handing down justice.
You blame your late aunt, Anne Zardari, for the death of your father?
Well, my aunt was Prime Minister at the time that her brother, who was a serving member, an elected member of Parliament, was killed. And it was her government not only that condoned that sort of violence at the time that her brother was killed. Some 3,000 men were murdered in very much the same way in Karachi, under operations sanctioned by the Prime Minister. But certainly they played a role in the cover-up after the fact.
You write about your father. You were very close to him, as you say, for many years while you were in exile. It was just the 2 of you. He was all yours. But he wasn't a saint, was he?
No, I don't think anyone was. And the story of this family is one that's built around myths. They're built up to be lions. You know, we have this tendency in Pakistan to make immortals out of men.
But have you done that in your book? I mean, there's nothing in that book to tell us, to quote William Dalrymple, that your father had a reputation for being trigger-happy. His bodyguards were rough. He was alleged to have sentenced to death several former associates.
Well, all those claims against him were made by the dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq that filed some 90-odd cases of treason and sedition against my father. All of those cases carried the death penalty. Until now, 15 years after his death, his name is being cleared. He still has lawyers representing him. In all those cases, he's never been found guilty of any of those. And that was part of the myth. You know, there was a myth created around this family that one member was democratic, one member was not democratic, one member was temperate and tolerant, and one was violent and trigger-happy, as you say. Though, in fact, if we look at the history of Pakistan, that violence was seen very much in democratic governments. Not just Benazir's, but certainly in her father's as well. So part of the book was to take apart some of these myths, not just of my father, but certainly of those that came before him.
Is the best way to get justice to enter politics yourself?
No, not at all. That seems to be the worst way to get any kind of justice, I think.
But there are many who expect you to run at the next general election.
Well, I think they've been expecting that for a while because we've so destroyed our political culture that it's no longer become about platforms or ideas. It's just become about blood. It's become about names. But, you know, I think Pakistan has to choose now whether it wants to side with dynasty or with democracy. But in Pakistan's case, it certainly can't have both.
Not even with the right person?
Well, 30 years of dynasty in Pakistan have showed us that there is no such thing as a right person when you bring dynasty into the equation, because dynasty is the polar opposite of democracy.
You're very outspoken. Do you ever fear for your safety?
You know, I think a lot of Pakistanis fear for their safety. I think at the moment we know that violence has become part of the political ethic of Pakistan, and if your voice is inconvenient, that is the easiest way to remove it. But that doesn't just pertain to me. I think you see that every day in Pakistan.
But you'll never leave?
Well, it's home, and we know if we leave, in whose hands we leave it.
But you said you wouldn't go into politics, so what difference would it make?
Oh, I don't think politics is the only way to make change. It's certainly not the best way to make change in Pakistan. And if you look at where change is coming from, it comes from ordinary Pakistanis. It doesn't come from generals, and it doesn't come from dynasts. It comes from journalists and lawyers and activists and women. That's the hope for Pakistan, always.
Fatima Bhutto, many thanks for taking the time
to
talk to us.